share some of my research. So I wanted to talk a bit about some of the sort of larger scale land use transitions in Europe, some environmental policies that this links to, in particular the reforestation agenda, but to kind of put you into the bigger theoretical framework. I think it's a good one for all of these long-term forest cover changes is always the forest transition curve. So the idea that countries over their long-term development start with a relatively high forest cover if that's the default vegetation cover, then they start to kind of develop commodity production, agriculture, timber harvesting, and that leads them to deforest. That's what we see in many parts of the southern hemisphere right now. But at a certain point, you get down to a stabilizing level, and maybe even to a recovery of some of forest cover, which has to do with a lot of things, with sort of more productivity in agriculture that concentrates in smaller areas, trade where some of the land use demanding things are being farmed out to other countries, wages that are increased that make marginal production in marginal farmlands unprofitable, etc. And that's certainly what we've seen in Europe. And I think a lot of the big policy interventions that are happening in favor of forests internationally, they are trying to, for any given level of development or time or whatever you want to put on this x-axis, you want to kind of increase the curve, have more forest cover for any of those levels. So for instance, the whole thing about REDD+, the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, is about pushing this curve upwards for some of those countries that are facing strong deforestation pressures. But in the European sense, it's we already have some forest recovery, significant forest recovery over the last century, particularly from abandoned farmlands. And the picture of what we want to do in terms of policy interventions is much more complex. We don't just want more forests. Sometimes we are in the interventions that we are making. We are looking for particular mosaics. We're looking for biodiversity outcomes. We are certainly also sometimes looking for less forests, actually, where we see that forests are encroaching on, for instance, on farmlands that are part of an agricultural landscape mosaic that are seen as traditionally interesting, or we see it in relation to wildfire risks, particularly here in the Mediterranean. So this to give you as a bit of a bigger context. But then the questions I would like to zoom in on in this presentation is mostly about the forest restoration agenda. We have since the Bonn Challenge and various other things, we have a big shift of attention towards promoting reforestation, but there are different ways to do it, and here I want to sort of look a bit in my presentation at the advantages we could have in putting more emphasis on natural restoration. And that includes processes such as rewilding, for instance, which in Northern Europe is probably a more popular concept than it is here, but nevertheless restoration processes with a greater participation of nature. And the question is, to what extent could the national restoration agenda be more effective in achieving some key environmental goals and looking at two the sort of the biggest public goods that we want from forests are, well, mitigation of greenhouse gas changes and global warming, and biodiversity conservation. 2 points on the agenda. And as an economist, of course, we also want to know how cost effective is the whole thing, right? How much does it cost? So if we look now a bit closer at some of these long-term changes in European forest cover. So this is just for the last 30 years or so, where we can see, there's a strong increase of 0.3 percentage points over summing up to 37 points. If we go a bit further for the last 70 years of increase. And a lot of it is, and Spain is one of the most important countries, as you know, but also other Mediterranean countries, and also in Eastern Europe, some of the old Comecon countries where agriculture has gone back quite a lot. What is sometimes missed by people is that this has actually gone along with a huge carbon sink function, and that is a function, and that is in part a function of that area expansion of 37%, but it's also a function of a change, secular change in forestry that has made a lot of the forests we have more intensive in timber management. So we have created these big timber fabrics that also capture a lot of forest carbon. And therefore we have faced since the 60s, there's a huge increase in roundwood production. We are perhaps now in the recent decade or so, we are starting also to see a certain saturation. We see some climate change impacts that also make some of these more specialized timber forests more vulnerable to climate change and more ecologically sensitive. So we have seen some decline in that function and a need for adaptation. But also in recent times, we've also seen biofuel harvests increase, and that has some biodiversity consequences. And I would think that with the recent development in energy prices, that we haven't seen the last of that. If we look at the tree composition, I mean, a lot of other forests in Europe are even-aged with relatively few species, and many of them are quite intensively managed. That goes for most of Europe. The flip side of that, old-growth forests, it's very little that is left in terms of its small fragments, especially in the boreal part of Europe, but also in the Tatras and in different of the mountain areas in particular. But very little old-growth forest left in Europe. So what about biodiversity trends? That was one of the things that we were also interested in. So it's hard to get good data for long-term biodiversity trends in Europe. and some of the meta-analysis that are out there, yeah, they will also find often different trends according to what indicators you look at. That's not only for Europe, that's for many other biodiversity trends where you try to look at things in a larger scale. It will differ according to, yeah, is it abundance, is it richness, is it diversity, is it turnover? They all show a slightly different picture. And it's also a question of how do we, in a meaningful way, distinguish between transient trends. For instance, climate change is causing some species to move, right? To move north, for instance, and that creates more biodiversity. But is that a quality improvement in biodiversity in those areas? Not necessarily, right? So there's also an issue about distinguishing between generalist or even invasive species versus rare and endemic species that are sort of the high quality biodiversity we would like to see. Some of the extinctions, you know, they will not become visible because you still have some species. You have, like on Galapagos, you have this lonely George, this turtle that is 100 years old, and it's the last of its species. It's still there, but it's you have this sort of living dead that are not viable, genetically not viable populations. So there's some time lags in some of the negative effects to play out. And also, we have a lot of the data we have are often on birds because of bird watching sort of being an important activity, and because it's relatively easy. But a lot of the monitoring is in it's in protected areas. It's in sites with relatively little human activity. If we look at the long-term picture, at least. So there's this paradox often that you can actually have some locally increasing levels of biodiversity, and still that on a larger scale, of a continental or global scale, it's actually hiding a negative picture. So for turning to the birds data here, what we can see in this sort of a bit simplified division between that the EA is doing between farmland and forest birds, you can see well, our biggest biodiversity loss is in the farmlands actually, but also in the forests. In spite of the huge increase in forest area, it's not gone along with biodiversity improvement, on the contrary. So it's a picture that is kind of it's favorable for what has been sort of the carbon accumulation in forests, but it's not favorable for a biodiversity picture on a long-term view. So turning now a little bit to our sort of our policy and intervention options. This is kind of a simplified way of trying to look at, let's say we have a certain forest area available, and then we have like this land use slider here, the red bar that we can slide to the left or to the right, according to what we want. We want more areas. So this is, you can't see that so well here, but this is forest plantations. This is the natural forests and old growth, or whatever you would want to say. And this is kind of the multifunctional forest where you mix different functions. And the question is, what is optimal? Where should we be going? To the right or to the left? My argument here is that for a long time we have been going to the right. Right? There's a strong, especially in Central Europe, but maybe also to a certain extent here in the Mediterranean, there's been sort of this strong discourse about multiple forest management, and that we should, since we are a lot of people and we have few forests, we should try to accommodate a lot of different functions in our forests. But if we look at some of this literature about land sparing versus land sharing, actually in terms of the biodiversity outcomes, the land sparing options have generally superior performance. So yeah, you may be able to share functions, but in the end, your biodiversity is not your biodiversity gain is not going to be very large. So it raises some effectiveness questions about multiple forest management in Europe, and to what extent it really achieves what we want for species. And this is echoed, by these are two of my colleagues. I think Bruno is now an associate or so, but Magda works with me in EFIMED in Barcelona. That from a genetic point of view have made the argument in this letter to Nature that to conserve biodiversity we may need more space for natural selection to have free reign. We may need to set aside more spared lands for biodiversity purposes. So diving a bit now into the rewilding literature that is emerging. This is actually a Spanish colleague of ours that is still in results in preparation under the rewilding project that I'm part of, where they've been looking at they've taken nature's contributions to people as the ICPB sort of terminology, IPVS terminology, and try to look at how different rewilding actions were evaluated in terms of regulating non-material and material changes. And as one could expect, rewilding means that you manage less, but also you don't extract things from these areas. You try to leave them alone, right? And that means you're gonna lose something what you would normally have harvested from these areas. And that's what you find here. But in terms of some of the more psychological supporting identities, psychological experiences, the way how we experience these landscapes, most of them are positives, some of them are negatives. Some people, and we see that also in European surveys about that we've been doing in the WildE project. Now we can see that it's a very divided public, where there are a lot of people that like these rewilded areas, but some of them prefer the cultural landscape, the farming landscape, etc. But where the real benefits is in terms of some of the regulating services, in particular habitat creation for some of these threatened species. I think that one, the PDF conversion killed that one. But what I can say is it's something about it's another meta-study on the economic effects of rewilding. And the conclusions are that there are very few studies that look at that by now. It has not been a big focus in the literature. There are clearly more net positive than negative effects till now, and a lot of that comes from tourism and recreation benefit, which again has to do with some of these landscapes benefit that I mentioned before. So some of my own team's studies within this sort of rewilding initiatives. One is, I'm going to show two slides from two different areas. One is the Sveaskog, which is the state forest timber company in Sweden, and they have some eco parks where they have set aside areas where this is their kind of usual forest management cycle, and so if you choose to take areas out of that production, then you can calculate the opportunity costs, the revenues foregone, etc., and can calculate the sort of the costs as a net present value over time. So what we did find on that basis, there were some old set-aside areas. There are some new ones, and there's some production forests. And what we can see is, both the old reserve areas and also the newly set-aside areas, they don't have the same productivity as the average production areas. And we asked, Sveaskog said, oh, that's not on purpose. That's not because we wanted to save profits, by setting aside the worst production area. It's simply that some of these marginal areas that are maybe on hillsides or maybe in more swampy areas, etc., they were chosen due to their biodiversity effects. Potential, but they were also not the greatest timber production areas, right? So that means it's maybe not as expensive as one should fear if you can choose some of these marginal areas, you don't lose as much. Now, this is a very different example of Gelder support. Is in the Rhine Delta, or just on the other side of the German border in the Dutch part. It's kind of an emblematic rewilding area where they've sort of had this room for the river program, where they've been restoring sort of the Rhine Delta and allow it to flood a larger area. And the big advantage that this has had is for flooding management. They had a big flooding event in I think some 50 years ago or so in Holland, and so one of the problem is that they've been trying to steer the river too much, and now they've been they've been digging out some of these areas for the river to come back and flood certain areas and abandon some of the agricultural areas and let them grow back into a vegetation that is providing a better flooding protection as well. So this has overall been a success, and there's obviously some agricultural net present value loss. This is kind of the discount rate that you see taking its toll here. But it's been a big success in terms of creating new recreational income, tourism, etc. A lot of these areas have experienced a revival. So just to also look at the global south, what do we know there about the natural restoration versus the reforestation, replanting forests? this is kind of I think I've also lost a few things there, but this Jonah Bush's meta study was trying to model and extrapolate some of the estimates we have out there. What we can see is what we could have seen if if it had been converted, is that natural forest regeneration is a bit slower, but it's like a 1 to 2 magnitudes cheaper, because it is just very expensive to reforest actively areas also in the tropics, and I think what we see in Europe is, because labor is more expensive, some of these relationships are even worse. So what does it mean? So I've been working a lot with payments for environmental services, providing conditional subsidies to landowners to do more pro-environmental actions. And certainly, I mean, a lot of what we have in Europe in PES, it's really linked to agri-environmental schemes, paying farmers to harvest later, to maybe retire certain areas, to a number of actions. And I think a lot of the forestry community would want some of that money to go into also forestry action, because currently what we have is in terms of land use, it's a bias. I mean, landowners are paid, are subsidized for their agricultural production, but forestry is not favored. So the extended argument is, maybe we should also look at some of these natural restoration options and see if subsidizing some of that can accelerate some of these biodiversity gains that we can potentially obtain. And there are obviously international examples out there. The US has had a bit on and off in terms of how much effort is done, but the conservation reserve program is one of the PES type of efforts of paying people to retire marginal farmland that provides little benefits economically, but could make a difference in environmental terms. So my last slide, so sort of for a few takeaways is that doing more of letting nature do more of the job of forest restoration that our societies want to. I think it will provide. It may provide some more sustained biodiversity benefits and at maybe a relatively low cost. That's something we still need to experiment. We still need to experiment with that some more. But there are some examples out there that certainly support that. I don't think the same can be said for climate change mitigation. I think a lot of these forests already are maxed out in terms of particular timber values. Now it's the question of how to sustain some of those carbon stocks in the face of climate change pressures and disruptions. So in terms of payments for environmental services as a public policies to subsidize these, the argument has already been made like 10 years ago. It's a political question, obviously. And finally, so sort of some of these rewilding strategies, I think in particular in the Mediterranean, there are some trade-offs. The notion of letting the landscape alone and let it regenerate, it's maybe complicated if we're talking about an ecosystem that for hundreds of years has been managed by people, so that it's very much of a co-evolution of human systems and adapted biological systems, and in particular there are some of the wildfire risks of abandoned farmlands growing back into forests, and we are looking at some of that also in Barcelona, and which is one of the case studies of the projects, looking at some of these trade-offs. I will finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven.
Yep.
Any questions, comments? I know it's not, I mean, it's a bit far from the top.
Så nu ska vi gå över till